Raghav, give this to mom, please. Give the phone to mother. Hi, guys. We're from the team of Red Lantern Analytica, and today we're going to be talking about the women's liberation movement in China. The speakers today are Ojasvi Rishita and Rishita Seth. So we'll be talking about the history of women's movements in China, which is prior to the 20th century. After which we will also be talking about the present status quo of women in China. I will be starting with the history of the women's movements prior to the 1970s. After which, up till the period of the 1970s, after which Rishita will be continuing from the 1970s until the present status quo. And I would like to begin now. One second. I'm so sorry. Um, So the like women in most cultures across the globe, women in China are also treated inferiorly and have a subpar status to men in Chinese society. So prior to 20th century, the situation was similar to this, where according to Taoism, men are seen as yang and women are associated with yin. So this provided and sort of reinforced the notion of patriarchy in Chinese society. And the Qing stated that great righteousness is shown in the position that men and women occupy in their correct places, the relative positions of heaven and earth. So men were seen as heaven and women were seen as earth. And of course, because of this idea and this belief, women had to be submissive and women had to obey their husbands or their father or their brother, and they had this subordinate role in society. Of course, at that point of time, there were a few legendary women, like in the Song Dynasty, for instance, we see this general called Liang Hongya, and we see this other legendary woman, warrior called Hua Moli. So songs were written about these warrior women, and they acted as a source of inspiration to the women, and they stood out in society. But overall, in general, for other women, the status was very poor in society. Coming down to the period following this, and this is perhaps the most important reason for why women were treated inferiorly in Chinese society, was the idea of filial piety. So the most systematic and institutionalized and deep-rooted oppression against women was due to this policy. It was given by Confucius, and it had three major components. So one was that women must obey the man, the second being that the citizens must obey the ruler, and the third being that younger citizens must obey the elder. So, for thousands of years, it was these three rules or obediences which helped in maintaining and reinforcing patriarchy in Chinese society. Of course, abusive practices like we see in India also, like female infanticide, illegal buying and selling of women, and wife beating was still prevalent in Chinese society, and since no definitive laws had come out to outrule these practices. But the most widespread and perhaps the most long lasting inhuman practice at this point in time was that of foot binding of women. So what essentially happened is that amongst the imperial circles of warriors in the 10th century, the emperors were so fascinated by the feet of young and small women, usually 4 to 5 years old, that it was associated with their beauty. So what they did was that they forcibly bent their feet at the bottom and they tied it with a cloth, and their feet remained bound for the rest of their lives. This resulted in their feet becoming deformed and making them dependent on men. So this practice continued in Chinese society for thousands of years. And then it was finally outlawed by the imperial edicts of this dynasty known as the Qing dynasty, which came into power in 1902. This dynasty was outruled in 1911. But I think the most important factors which contributed to the end of this inhuman practice was the reformist movement, which was started by a few intellectuals at this point. So this model was based on Western ideas. So it sort of advocated the introducing of a democratic social system in China, scientific orientation, as well as family and marriage patterns, which were based on sort of upliftment of women. So they advocated equality between men and women and consent in marriage, as well as larger participation of women in the labor force. So essentially, they were advocating emancipation of women. And this movement was known as the May 4th feminist movement. And this was one of its own kind because it was the first time where we see such a large section of society participating in a movement for the upliftment of women. This movement continued through the 1910s and 1920s. And so most intellectuals at this time started this movement because they were like protesting against corruption, incompetence of the warlord government, against foreign invasion of China. But it's important to note that Chinese society at this point in time was extremely weak. And the reason for the weakness in the society and for most underdeveloped societies at that point in time was essentially linked to the structure of the family. So if you look at the structure of the family, you see a wife being submissive, a wife blindly obeying her husband. Of course, foot binding, etc., was also prevalent. Minimal participation of women in the labor force or workforce, etc. So, in order to protect the Chinese society from humiliation and disarray, the solution at this point in time was liberation of women. Uh, but the issue with the May 4th feminist movement at that point in time is that its outreach was very limited, right? So it could reach out to a very limited section of women, particularly the elite women and women who were educated. It wasn't very widespread in its reach to women from lower sections of society, or women who were not educated, or women who were not employed in the labor force. But yet, I think the movement was successful and one of its kind because it was the first attempt to actually emancipate women in society. Then, after the revolt of 1949, there were drastic changes which took place in Chinese society, particularly in the lives of women. So there was the People's Republic of China, which came into being at that point in time. And there's this famous quotation by Mao Zedong, which I would like to state, which states that the determination by the government to raise women's status was such that women hold up half the sky. Then in 1949, a law was implemented by the People's Republic of China to abolish the feudal system. So the feudal system of serfdom was essentially one where the serf was dependent on the lord. And a lot of women were treated very badly under this system. So they were impregnated and they were totally dependent on their overlords at this point in time. But when the feudal system broke up, then essentially women got freedom, they got economic emancipation, and they could advocate their own rights, and they could have that sort of liberation in society. And then at that point in time, the Chinese Communist Party used this atmosphere of economic emancipation of women to pass through two documents, so two laws, which were the marriage law and the land law. So the land law gave women the right to inherit property. So initially under the Qing dynasty, only widows could inherit property once the husband died. But now even like property was supposed to be indiscriminate for women. Then after that, there was the marriage law, which allowed for marriage to be based on love and consent. It also outlawed the practice of prostitution and child concubinage, which were very widespread in Chinese society. And then, because of free marriage, women got free economic independence. Women could actually seek divorce, and they were also granted divorce. And women who were like approximately unhappy with their marriage were 1.3 women who actually went and sought divorce out of 1,000. But there was also campaigns at this point in time to mobilize women to participate in the workforce. And the new government of the People's Republic of China was also rebuilding the economy, especially the industrial economy, where they were setting up these social institutions where men and women could be employed in the labor force. And women were particularly employed in textile and silk industries and other such handicraft-oriented occupations. Then, but by 1953, the issue was that because there was such a large demand for labor force employment, and the fact that the jobs were limited, so the there was a maximum limit or maximum pool to which the number of women could be absorbed in the labor force. So, and the fact is that the marriage law, unlike the land law, brought widespread revolt from here because murder, suicide, etc., was very common amongst women after this. So then, after that, the government decided to prioritize collective stability instead of giving into individual whims and fancies of women. So there was stricter regulations with regard to the divorce law, and domestic duties of women also began to be changed. And the idea of a so-called socialist housewife who obeys her husband but at the same time has economic liberation was advocated at this point in time. Then after that, there was agriculture collectivization, where women took large part in the agriculture force, and there was the Great Leap Forward movement in 1958 in China. So this enhanced the economic development, the technological development in China. Women participation in the workforce was also increasing, and primarily occupations which were left by men or like male-dominated occupations which were um, vacated by men. Women took a part in these. Also, their family duties also increased during this point in time. And there were newly established institutions like cafeterias and kindergartens which were staffed by women at this point in time. But what needs to be noted is that though the Great Leap Forward movement did fail, What was noteworthy was that again it collectivized people on a larger scale than even the May 4th feminist movement or attempts by the party to like bring into reforms for women. And the fact is that um, a lot of women were brought into the workforce, more women than ever before. And then this culminated into the period of the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. And though these were the most chaotic years in Chinese history, the years following, 20 years following the Cultural Revolution have been prosperous and progressive for economic development, for relaxation in the political atmosphere, and for several economic reforms. But in spite of the political turmoil in China, the economy has been steadily growing. So, quoting facts and figures, we see it grows between 10% from 1981 to 1991 and approximately 12% from then till 1995. So we do see economic development despite political instability, and we do see emancipation of women on a large scale. Though we do see a gap between the actual theory and practice of the emancipation of women, even in that point of time, because we don't see any definite proof or documentation to back this up. So now that I've covered it, I think Rishita is going to carry on from the responses of the Cultural Revolution to the present status quo. So thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Jasvi. So, as Jasvi mentioned, I'll be talking about the phase after the post-cultural revolution. So, one thing that is really important to note is that there was an increase in government control over society during the cultural revolution phase, and as a direct result of that, there was a blatant increase in the representation of women in the labor force, as well as the amount of women who were participating in higher education. However, it is also interesting to note that there were the post-cultural revolution phase also held diametrically opposite results. So, while on one hand, women participation in many aspects of public life was at an all-time high, um, on the contrary, female infanticide also became a rampant problem, and this was because of the very controversial one child policy, which actually put women at a much greater disadvantage because the fact of the matter remained that no matter what legal changes were brought about in Chinese society, the cultural fabric was very much patriarchal, and as such, the girl child was seen as much less valuable than a boy child. And so, because you were only allowed to have one child, many families thought that it would be more valuable to have a male child instead. Also, one thing to note is that the All China Women's Federation, which was a body created to protect women's rights and promote their interest, was suspended during the Cultural Revolution phase, which showed that women's issues were not just ignored, but rather they were also not seen as different as male issues. And this was the fact that women's issues were almost always rendered to the backpedal because it was not seen as something important because Chinese society doesn't really see gender as anything but a social construct. So this is something that we notice. And further, after the aftermath of the post-cultural revolution, after the steam has flowed past, we see that there is a downward trend of educated girls, and there's a disproportionate decline in female students in all three levels of education, which was a very sad statistic, but this was what the reality was. And in addition to that, there was also systemic sex discrimination at educational institutions. And although there are not many government records that attest to this, there are various personal accounts of women that were in educational institutions in China that attest to the fact that there was institutionalized gender discrimination where there were greater opportunities afforded to the male students and not to the female counterparts. And this is again indicative of the very patriarchal and misogynistic fabric of Chinese society at a time, where a very popular saying was, it is a virtue for women to not be talented. And no matter, to the credit of the government, while they sort of legalized many issues of women's rights, they codified stuff like the marriage law, which just we talked about, and they made sure that women citizens were afforded the same legal rights. However, on the grassroots level, which is what we see in all countries around the world, the reality was very different. And this is because unless there was a change in the cultural and social fabric of the country, no amount of legal progress could amount to real time progress. And now we fast forward to the present day, the 21st century, and we think, okay, now we're living in a very globalized world. We're living in a world of heightened consciousness where women's issues are not seen as rare, they're seen as something as universal as human rights. But again, we see that there is a distinct paradox present in Chinese society when it comes to women's rights, because on one hand, you see the government going out of the way to pass laws and legalize things that benefit women, and we see the criminalization of domestic violence, which 30% of families in China at one point of time were affected by it. We see laws that broaden the definition of sexual harassment. We see laws criminalizing gender discrimination at the workplace and at educational institutions, but this does not translate to real life. And even within the government, we see, despite passing all these laws, it's not really the ideology is not kept in practice, because the Politburo till date only has two women members, and the inner circle has no women members. So the political laws don't really amount or translate to political reality. So the two are very, very disparate and very far from each other. And another interesting thing which further exemplifies this paradox in Chinese society is the incident known as the arrest of the Feminist Five, where in 2015 a group of five women protesters staged a demonstration against sexual harassment prevalent in the local transport, the public transport, and quite interestingly, these women were arrested for simply staging a protest against sexual harassment on the eve of when the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping was hosting the United Nations Summit for Women's Rights, which was on the fourth anniversary of the UN Conference for Women in Beijing. So this perfectly exemplifies the double standard that exists, where on one hand, on paper, you're doing all that you can to further the cause of women's rights, but it definitely isn't translating into real life, which is what genuinely matters. And even now we see, with the advent of globalization and intersectionalities being celebrated, feminism is becoming intersectional, and that is not the case in China, because we see obviously the brutal treatment of Uyghur women in the Xinjiang province, and they are subject to brutal treatments such as forced contraceptions, rapes, and abortions. And we really can't say that feminist movements in China are doing the most when they are ignoring a very important and a very crucial aspect of the population, especially when there is such a grave sort of denial of rights happening for one part of the population. And we see that it is certainly a very tumultuous journey of feminism. And we see a gradual but steady expansion of a feminist ethic. And, and this idea, unfortunately, is not exactly translating into Chinese society, because of the fact that it is so deeply rooted in its patriarchal beliefs. So on one hand, we can say legally they are at par at the rest of the world, perhaps, but in the ground, it really isn't translating to that. And modern day feminism in China, in many ways, adopted the Western ethic, the liberal ethic, and this we see by affording women political rights, and issues such as gender discrimination being and harassment at the workplace being championed. But we see that it definitely isn't at the point where it needs to be, and this is because of the fact that until there is some very deliberate attempt to face the ideas that Chinese society in many ways is built upon, then we can't really do anything much about the situation of women in China, because otherwise it's a cyclic experience where you can keep turning out laws like it's comes from a factory, but unless you are seeing actual change happen, then there isn't really any value to what is on paper unless it's being implemented in real life. So, with that, we come to the end of this concept series, and we hope we could give you a brief but well explained idea and insight into what feminism is in China. And to the credit of the government, legal acceptance and legal rights are a very important part of progress. But as we mentioned throughout, legal progress without social cultural progress is no progress at all. Um, so with that, we can um, wrap this entire conversation up. I
Uh, Before that, I
hand over.
think we'd like to take up questions which we've got from our
Yeah,
viewers. So, let's just see. What is the role of women in China's governance? So, first there was the Chinese Communist Party. So, there was the People's Republic of China. And the primary role of the People's Republic of China was advocating gender equality and emancipation of women. So, it's spoken about gender discrimination in the field of employment of women, particularly. And it's also emphasized how gender stereotypes shouldn't be catered to in Chinese society, how women should break out of this notion of a housewife or not seeking economic employment, particularly in the government. So we see about like the representation of women being increased at this point in time. Then in 2017, 2018, there was this new era of women's school which was being launched. And then we also see how women's role in the governance is increasing over the years. So there's approximately, it's approaching 30% now. But the fact is that, like we see in Indian society or any other society, patriarchy is so deeply rooted that most of the major posts, even with regard to the political parties, are reserved for men. And how even with regard to representation, even though women may be as qualified, as educated as men, the fact is that in ground reality, they aren't getting as much work as men are, and they aren't getting as much representation as they deserve. And but we do see that despite this, yeah, despite this, even women within the parliament, or I mean, women who are getting representation in government are also subjected to discrimination. So there's a Human Rights Watch report which was published in 2018, which said that approximately 87% of women uh, who were in strong and dominant positions were also reported to have expressed gender discrimination. So we do see that there are a lot of problems for women in Chinese society, even in certain states. With regard to the minority women in China and the Uyghurs, so we see in the news how Uyghur women are subjected to, violation of human rights, how they are tortured, they're kept in these camps, and sometimes, they aren't even given contraceptives or abortion pills, or the fact that a lot of them are even like we don't even know in ground reality whether they're being beaten up, etc. But I think
right.
I can go more into detail with that because she's also written about that.
Yeah. So the life of minority women. When we're talking about the Uyghur women, we can also see that they're in a way being weaponized to be used as a tool for psychological and sociological decimation, right? Because we see that the woman almost universally is seen as a symbol of a society's honor, as the main sort of embodiment of value and everything that the culture holds. So we see that Uyghur women, in that respect, are being weaponized to affect psychologically the emotions and the psyche of the Uyghur population, because they're subject to absolutely inhuman treatment. There are forced abortions, forced contraceptions, forced marriages with Chinese men. So it is definitely a very, very stark and a disturbing situation. And the fact of the matter remains that there isn't really much public opinion fighting for this cause. And we could amount that to anything in China, to be very honest. We could amount that to the
Rishita,
fact
what
that the increased censorship as well. But one thing that we know for sure that is a fact is that these women are being used as tools. These women are being used to send across a greater message, because there is no other sensible reason as to why these things would happen. And abortions and contraceptions are an effective way of ensuring that a genocide takes place without modern violence, because it is effectively cutting off the race. I mean, if the women cannot reproduce, then you're not really going to have any more Uyghurs around. So it is definitely a very sophisticated technique, but brutal nonetheless. So that's what I
But
think is the life of
what's
minority women.
disappointing, Rishita, is the fact that when we see like portrayal of Uyghurs in general or like media houses, we see reports coming in about torture and Uyghurs in general being kept in camps, but we see barely any attention being given to Uyghur women in particular. So we feel like
Exactly.
mainstream media should divert their attention towards this and bring their issues to the forefront because their battle
Right.
is quite hard. And I
Yes.
think
I
another issue which we both also would like to bring up is the idea of domestic violence. So we see
yeah.
domestic violence, which is extremely widespread in Chinese society. In fact, a 2013 study by ACWF shows that a quarter of Chinese women are being subjected to domestic violence even today. So in 2001, there was a law which tried to advocate, remedies for women who were subjected to domestic violence. And then again in 2005, there was this law which uh, made it legally punishable for a woman to be domestically or sexually harassed in any way. So, despite these laws being passed and these remedies being provided to women, we still see a lot of women being silent because they are afraid, and a lot of cases not coming into mainstream media and being reported. So, if perhaps these cases were reported, then they might be even higher than 1/4. And we do feel that it is the responsibility of the government, it is the responsibility of the public to raise awareness of these issues and to sort of provide more remedy to these women and empower them to step up and actually, seek either divorce or speak up against their abuser or approach courts. So yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's all the questions that we had. So